a few. Okay, I think we can come back together now. I see some people are starting to ask some outstanding questions, and people are starting to chat in the chat link there. Let me mention to everybody, please in the chat turn your to field. Make sure that all of your messages go to all panelists and attendees. It's not selected by default. And if you're just joining now, you won't see any of the chat messages above. So I'll just be reminding people of that in a few minutes. So let me stop my sharing here and bring everybody up to gallery view. And so hello and welcome to the QA session. So we have some awesome panelists on today, and I would love it if, so we have Reza Shadmehr, Shreya Saxena, and Zhengwei Wu. And we might see Maurice come in, Maurice Smith come in a bit later. I haven't seen him show up in the list yet, but maybe he'll ping us when he arrives. And I would love it if you could introduce yourselves. So Reza, can we start with you?
Okay. Thank you, Zach, and welcome all of you guys students. And it's so wonderful to read some of the questions you're asking. So I'm Reza Shadmehr. I was born in Iran, and I've been lucky to be allowed to stay in the United States for 40 some years, and have a job. And I'm a scientist. I work at Johns Hopkins, and I'm so happy to be here with you today.
Thank you, Reza. And Shreya.
Hi everyone, I'm Shreya Saxena. I grew up in India and Switzerland, and then I came to the US to do my master's in biomedical engineering at Johns Hopkins, actually, which is where I was lucky enough to meet Reza. And then went on to do my PhD at MIT in electrical engineering. And currently I'm at Columbia University doing my postdoc in the Center for Theoretical Neurosciences. And I am also going to be starting my faculty position this fall in electrical engineering at the University of Florida. I'm excited to see all of your questions, and yeah, let's get started.
We have one more panelist that I would love to introduce, or have her introduce herself. Zhengwei, can you unmute yourself and unblack yourself?
Oh.
Your video is off.
Oh, not sure how to do that. But okay,
I don't see her in the, sorry, I don't see her in the panelists section. Is that why her video is not
okay,
showing?
that might be, okay, so we'll work on that. Meanwhile, Zhengwei, why don't you just say hi?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Zhengwei Wu, and I graduated with a background in electrical engineering from University of Pennsylvania, and I'm now a postdoc in Xaq's lab. I'm working on modeling behavior, and it's great to see all the questions and to talk to the students now. Yeah, thank you.
Excellent. I'm working to promote Zhengwei to a panelist so that oh, I can hover over her name. Okay, let's see. I don't see where to do that. In the participants list. So she's, okay, there we go. Here we go. More, promote to panelist. There we go. Oh, now she's gone. But now she's going to unmute.
She's there.
Good. Welcome back. Okay. Yay. Excellent. Okay. And so, yes, Zhengwei was one of the creators, the core creator of the tutorials that you're expressing your enjoyment of today. So let's start in, this is a Q&A session. Let's start in with some upvoted questions. So Maximilian asks, the examples of optimal control in the lectures were mostly about modeling behavior. And so what are some examples of optimal control in the brain? It's a great question. Who wants to start with that one? Reza, you want to take a stab at it?
Reza.
Sure, yeah. The people who study motor control, limb movements in particular, study behaviors that have something to do with the motor cortex. And the lab of Steve Scott has really championed the idea that optimal feedback control, which is, as you know, you have a policy, you have a state that you estimate where you are, and then you apply a feedback gain that says, this is the action that I should do. So they've been looking at both behavior of animals and humans, as well as some of the activity in the motor cortex in the context of optimal feedback control.
We can also imagine thinking that the brain may be regulating itself as part of what it controls. So, your body regulates all sorts of parts, and you can consider different components of that to be internal controls. Like you regulate your heart rate, you regulate your breathing rate, you regulate all sorts of different processes. You may regulate different activations of brain areas. You go to sleep. And so if you imagine modularizing the brain, then you can define control being even within the brain. People talk about cognitive control as a way of routing information around. So one of the general questions that's going to arise in that case is, what counts as an action? What are you allowed to do as you're controlling stuff? And then the converse of that is, what counts as a state upon which you base your actions? So those are crucial questions whenever you're going to define things as control. But anytime you act in the world, control is a very natural mathematical framework for that. Shreya, you want to add anything there?
I think both of you put that really well. I agree with what you just said, Zach, about as soon as there's basically a state that an agent is acting upon. Now, whatever you want to consider an agent, that could be a brain region acting on another brain region. So we see this, in for example, you can consider the basal ganglia acting on the cortex as, basically, an agent acting on another brain region. So really, it's a modeling choice, which I think makes sense for the brain, as well as when we're looking at limb control, motor cortex, as Reza pointed out. That's another very good example of where the state could be the actual either the muscle signals or the actual kinematics of the limb, and the brain could be considered, and the motor cortex along with the other regions could be considered the controller. So I think that these are exactly the kinds of examples we usually think about when looking at optimal control in the brain.
Another one that we might mention in the context of engineering or medicine is brain-computer interfaces. So you have two ways of control. You have outbound control, where the brain can control, let's say, a robotic limb, or you can have inbound control, where you have an external sensory apparatus, which is controlling part of the brain. So you can actually view sensory inputs as the world controlling you, and actions as you controlling the world. And you can flip that around and say you also have an external prosthetic, a sensory prosthetic, which could control you. Hey, Mariam.
So control is everywhere.
Yeah, control is I mean, like, Bayesian inference is a beautiful mathematical framework that considers how you figure out what's in the world. And so it's kind of an umbrella for perception. And control is conversely an umbrella for action. And in fact, there's a duality there that multiple people have described, where you can view control as an inference problem, but an inference on where you want to be instead of where you are. So I think that that's a pretty cool framework that, like, Bert Kaplan has worked in, and Emo Todorov, and even Kalman acknowledged this duality. Let's see. Next question we have. Let's see. Is there direct evidence that the brain actually engages in optimal control, similar to neurons tracking evidence or reward prediction errors? Or is optimal control better thought of as a normative framework? Zhengwei, do you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah. So actually, this is a very good question, and usually that depends on how we think about optimality. So like, if in most of the cases, the agent or for example, in a task, the agent may not have a very clear idea of what is the real model or what is the dynamic for the world state. So in that sense, although the model may have some mismatch, the agent still act optimally according to its own understanding of the model. So in that sense, we can say that the agent is is rational, or bounded rational instead of optimality, because there might be, that's because of the mismatch of the model. So that's how I understand so that's really depends on how we define optimality, and to what extent this optimality is used by the agent.
I like it. Reza, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, so the question is is there evidence that the brain actually engages in optimal control? The ecologists that study animal behavior are very much interested in this. And the theory of optimal foraging, which is a normative model of behavior, is deeply rooted in this notion that does the behavior of the animal in the real environment in which the animal lives, does it comply with a theory that says it's trying to maximize this global capture rate, which is based on measurements of energy that are being spent doing things and the energy that's being acquired from reward divided by time.
So you said it did not accord with that notion?
It does, yeah, it does. Some of it does, but some of it doesn't, because there are instances where our behavior isn't just based on the simple utilities that we write. There are risks. I know that there are questions that are being asked about the risk, for example, and just by being out there foraging, you are exposing yourself to predators, and that's a risk. And so ecologists think about, well, how do we input the risk into these equations? And there are thoughts about that.
Yeah, there's a whole field of risk-sensitive control, right? Which is like what happens when you have outliers. Like one of the things that we use in the Bellman equation, which is one of these core equations to describe what your goal is you try to maximize your expected utility. But what if you want to minimize your risk? That's a different loss function, and you can construct a Bellman equation for that, which is, instead of averaging over transitions, you could minimize or maximize over the value.
I was just going to add on that point that a lot of the times we really come up with a good cost function to describe the behavior. So, yes, you can have optimal control as long as it fits what we are seeing in the data and in the experiments. But if it doesn't fit, we just modify the loss function. We add more constraints in order to actually have the model describe the experiments well. So I think that it's an iterative process.
Gotcha. Yeah.
One comment that I can make about optimality is that it is in some ways, a proven real wrong approach to biology. And all you got to do is look at the way animals move. So if you look at whales and how they swim, and you compare it to other types of animals that are in the water, fish, and what you notice is that whales, of course, because they're mammals and they used to live on land, they have gone back in the water. They swim very differently than dolphins, similarly, right, than fish do. And that tells you that it's evolution that is constraining how they could possibly swim. It's their spinal cord that is bending in a very different way than fish. And it's because they have a different history. And so there is no optimal way to swim without knowing what is your history.
Yeah, this gets at, again, I think what Zhengwei was saying about constraints. Like, what are the constraints under which you're allowed to do your flexible thing? It also is evocative of the debate about Bayesian inference in biology. So you can always construct some kind of prior under which the observed behavior or decisions or perception is optimal according to whatever weird prior. But the question then becomes, is that a good prior? Does that, the key question that we would have to answer is, does it generalize? And so if you say that we have a loss function like Shreya, you mentioned, like we construct a loss function that seems to describe what people prefer and what motivates them, then you can see whether that notion of an objective generalizes into new tasks. And that's the way that you can make it not tautological. Because otherwise we run that risk of having something non-falsifiable. Vasishta asks, is there a meta-optimal control framework for determining what is optimal? Yeah, exactly. there is meta learning, and part of this is what you'll see tomorrow in terms of reinforcement learning, because optimal control is basically the end result of a good job of learning. And the question is, how do you get there? How do you, if you start from not understanding the task, not understanding your body, not knowing your own objectives, and not knowing where rewards come from, and then you gain experience by trying stuff in the world, then eventually you can come to a better understanding and maybe a good or even optimal one. But that process of getting from here to there is learning, and that's the domain of reinforcement learning, which you'll discuss tomorrow. Let me just also quick mention for those of you who just joined us in the chat, please change, if you're chatting in the window here, change your chat, the to field, to all panelists and attendees, because I think by default it's not set to that. And then everybody can talk and chat together that way. Okay, let's see. Samuel Orion asks, how on earth does a biological system evolve to implement optimal foraging theory? Mind blown. How do you grow a network to implement this? Or is it a solution that the brain implements due to experience?
Yeah, there have been some recent experiments that people are doing in labs and recording from neurons to ask, is the decision making that not only that their animals' behavior is consistent with largely with the predictions of the theory, but how are they doing it? Which neurons are controlling their behavior? And optimal foraging, what's interesting about it is, in some sense, it's simple. It requires two variables. It requires your history. It requires a variable that keeps a measure of your history, and it requires a measure of the current rate in which you are acquiring things. And a comparison between these two rates is supposed to tell you when to abandon and leave. I've had enough of this. I can do better elsewhere.
So I think maybe this question is also getting at mechanistically, how is it actually implemented? Biologically, how do we evolve to implement this? And that's often there's often almost a disconnect between macro level models describing these kind of phenomenology. Anyway, these macro level behaviors, and then down to the mechanistic, how exactly is it implemented? So yeah, I mean, this is always a good discussion point, and there are very few answers, unfortunately, connecting these two levels.
Well, I was asking if you can have a parameter which adjusts things, like changes your cost function as a function of time or age or context or something like that, which might allow you to make something that change the goal. Is that something that can we fold that into optimal control when the goalposts are themselves moving? Is that maybe we can treat that as another latent variable in the system that's just part of your history, that it's part of your state that you have to base your decisions on, and your state is like time or age or hunger or whatever your motivation system is, and then it's just a fixed context.
In that case, we may need some hierarchical model to model another layer of that latent variable.
Yeah, I think that's right. These hierarchical models are maybe one of the reasons why we have deep networks in our brains, that we have models of models of models. Zhengwei, there's a question here that I think you would be able to answer for the students. So Zhuwei Huang asks, is rho something that is inherent to the system or something we can control? So just to clarify, rho, this is about the tutorials. You have a state cost and an action cost, and the weighting on the action cost is rho. And so then can you control rho? And in the jetpack example, would rho represent how much fuel a movement takes or the precision of the movement?
Yeah, actually this rho depends on the weight like how much weight we put on the cost of actions. And I think the answer is yes, we can definitely control this role according to the application, like how much we care about the action, the cost on action, or how much we care about to making the state as close as to the goal trajectory as possible. Yeah, so yeah.
Shreya, you want to add anything to that?
I think Zhengwei definitely covered it. Just to directly state that it's something that we can control, and that is one of the ways we have to define our loss function. So how much do we, as Zhengwei said, how much do we care about the cost of the action as opposed to the cost of the error, the state versus the goal error.
Here's a question from Shuqi Liu, which is, I think, related. So in the case of a moving target, now you have like the regulator example. Why is it beneficial for the action at time t to be a combination of the current distance to the target and also a planned action? I guess she's referring to a bar, the quantity in the tutorial. How do we rely? So that's one question. Why is it beneficial to take the loss as a function of both of those? And then how do we reliably estimate the goal trajectory in the first place? If we have no idea of how the goal evolves over time, or it might be completely random, is it still useful to incorporate the planned action in the current, for the next step in the current action? So the first one is it beneficial to think about having both I would say feedback control and maybe open loop control or a planned action? Feed
forward control is maybe a better way to put it, because it still does use the state at every time t. A bar is a function of the state. But just to crack at the first part of that, the controller doesn't actually come into the equation when you're designing a bar. So a bar, which is the function of the planned action at t+1, that's g of t+1. A bar is not actually is not a function of the controller. So it's really just a function of the system parameters, D and B, as well as the current state, as well as G of t+1. But that gets fed to the, that gets added to the output of the controller. The controller action is A, which is a function of the L that we have been looking at in tutorial 2, L of t times S of t. So really, that's exactly why. So we dissociate these two because one is a function of just the planned trajectory. So that's the G of t+1, or G in general. And the other is a function of the controller. So that's exactly why we dissociate those two things. If you want to consider them, as part of the same thing, that's totally fine. But this is how we think about them. How do we reliably estimate the goal trajectory? Yeah, that's a very good question. I think that's exactly, that kind of gets to, first of all, how are these, for example, in the brain, I mean, how do we come up with this G of t? That could be one brain region that's doing that, and another brain region then takes over and actually implements the control policy. But anyway, it's a very good question that is, that's difficult to answer, I think. There are parts of, even in machines, there are parts that are basically geared towards just that, just estimating that goal trajectory, that G of t.
Yeah, there's two parts of that. One is, how do we as an acting agent estimate our own desires or where things are rewarding? And that's reinforcement learning. And then there's the question of how we as scientists estimate what some other animals' desires or goals are. And that would be inverse reinforcement learning. You can basically infer what they want from what they do. But they're flip sides of the same kind of coin. In both cases, you have to figure out where to go based on what rewards you get.
it's usually just posited in a lot of experimental paradigms, right? You know, if you ask the person, let's say the subject, to go from one point to the other, you posit that the goal trajectory should just be as fast as possible, getting to that goal state. So it's just usually just posited.
So Vasishta asks, if, say, the cerebellum uses models of optimal control for movement, how can we know, how can we test that? How can we test that experimentally?
I think I can take a crack at that. People are starting to do that, not specifically about the cerebellum, but various parts of the brain, the motor cortex, the anterior cingulate. And you know what, the things that I've seen in the literature are to look at the variables that we have in those equations and say, do I find changes in the activity of this group of neurons that resemble one of these variables? And to be honest with you, I don't think that the results are convincing yet, at least so far. I haven't seen it, but the approach has typically been to look for correlates of those variables in neural activity.
So if you had something like a control gain, let's say, that might be not even a variable that you could find a correlate of in the neural activity, but it might be present in the synapses.
Yeah.
So that then you could find a correlate in the relationship between some neuron and a muscle, let's say. That could be an indication of the strength of the connections between those neurons and the motor plant that's outputting it. But in general, go ahead, Shreya.
No, go ahead, finish your thought.
I'm done.
I was going to add to that point that sometimes it's useful to look at lesion studies. So if parts of the cerebellum, let's say, or other parts of the brain don't function anymore, then the outputs are different, and we can really try to infer what role that brain region was playing just looking at the differences in the output.
Very nice point, Shreya.
One of the examples that I've seen used to illustrate control is the eye movement system. If you want to fixate at a point, you need to make sure that your muscles are in the right tension so that your eye can stay there. And if you want to look somewhere else, then you have to be able to move and hold your muscles at that point. So you have a target and you have some balance there. And there's always muscle noise, which is process noise in the terminology we've been using, that you have to compensate for. Otherwise, your eye will wander off. And in fact, there are patients who have trouble maintaining fixation, and that condition is called nystagmus. So if you look up nystagmus, which is kind of a cool spelled word, you can see videos of people who are trying to fixate, but their eyes will, like, say they're trying to fixate over here, but their eyes keep drifting back towards center. That's one kind. Or their eyes keep deviating to one side or another, and they can't hold it still. They have to keep pulling their eyes back with a big jump instead of a little jump. And these are thought to be related to a control gain that's too high or too low. If your control gain is too high, then you can have an unstable system that doesn't have the right feedback.
You should have seen this in tutorial 2, one of the exercises.
Right.
So is that possible?
This is a great biological example of that. Sorry, Zhengwei.
Yeah, sure. So is that possible that they just have a different cost function? Like their definition of the cost function may differ from what is the purely normal defined way?
I don't think so. Nystagmus is a deficit that comes about associated with a part of the brainstem called the interpositus, and it is a mathematical integrator, effectively. And it's a part of the system that does what's called holding, and holding is related to moving. And the neural system that holds is, as Xaq said, it's an active process to do it. And it appears to do it as a function of what brought you there, a different control system altogether. And there seems to be the neural networks that are used to describe it are these systems that feed back on each other. They integrate, and then they hold the value that they have integrated until you move again.
So there are actually neural responses in response to Miguel's question here, where you can look at these kind of models, not just in terms of what behavioral output you produce, but also in terms of the neural mechanism that implements it. So in the goldfish, David Tank and Sebastian Sung and colleagues have looked at that integrator, and they can find different neurons that are sensitive to eye position. Their firing rate is silent, and then it has a threshold, and then it rises. And you have different slopes of that input-output relationship between position and activity. And all of that can be modeled as feeding back on itself to control what you want the way you want it. And if you break that, the weights on that, the gain of the recurrence, then you break the ability to hold the eye in one position. And you can see that in the goldfish eye. So these are not just behavioral models.
Oh, so one of the most wonderful things that I've experienced is sitting in lectures by a professor at Hopkins. His name was David Robinson. He taught medical students using control theory about the brainstem and the eye, and how basically, if you look at the various components of a feedback controller, and how if you break this part of it, it's this nucleus, and here's the symptom. And so many physicians that came away from his lectures understood the fact that mathematics and control theory are really useful ways by which to diagnose neurological disorders.
That sounds great. I found that control theory, remarkably, is something that is under-taught. I never encountered it until much later in my studies. And that's perplexing, given that it's action, right? This is the description of how we act, and how can we not, while we have a lot of mathematical teachings and a lot of neurosciences dedicated to the sensory systems, and some to the motor systems, but not so much in the control that can link the two of those. So hopefully this tutorial helped plant a seed for you that will grow into a rich understanding of the connections between these different fields. Inception, yes. Okay, let's see. What else do we have here? So Alan asks, are the models today how models or why models? And do POMDPs actually describe real or optimal behavior of organisms? I think this is a fun question. How models or why models? Anybody want to take a crack at that? Both?
I guess the hope is that they do describe actual behavior. If we just formulate it the right way, the actual and optimal behavior is actually one and the same thing. It would be my 2 cents.
So one of the totally agreed, and optimality. I mean, optimality has been an incredibly useful tool for structuring our understanding of biological systems. Barlow was one of the early people working on this, and for me, this was the thing that brought me into neuroscience. I got so excited. I saw Bill Bialik give a talk where he was talking about optimality principles, and he referred to Barlow and the scaling of eyes and diffraction, and showing that you could use physics to say, this is the best way to design an insect eye. And here's the data, and bang, they live right on top of each other. And that is amazing. But it's, and somebody in the chat mentioned the photon counting that we are able to do in the dark. So these optimality benchmarks are wonderful, but there are plenty of examples where we don't at least seem to be reaching optimal performance. And so then optimal gives you like, this is how well you could do. And this is, you're not surprised then if an animal is reaching optimality in that sense. But when they're suboptimal, there are so many ways that it could be suboptimal. We kind of lose our way, because why are they suboptimal? What are the constraints that prevent them from being suboptimal? Is it just not that beneficial? Like you get an extra 5% juice if you're optimal? So these are, I think, important questions when you're applying this in practice. And then one of the crucial constraints that we have is the how questions. Like maybe neurons cannot compute the kind of predictions that they would need to be optimal. Or maybe they can, but it just takes computational resources. Like the questions that we've posed here, the framework of control is a framework where you talk about state costs, which is a behavioral goal, and action costs, which is again behavior. But it does not include computational costs, which is the cost that it would take to, fire action potentials. And maybe there are some things that are suboptimal if you didn't have to pay for thinking. But when you do have to pay for thinking, then you realize, well, that optimal thing, what you called optimal before, is no longer optimal. And this can unify the notion of how and why models.
So in the 70s, there were experiments that tried to ask questions about evolutionary impact of equations like the ones that I described in my talk. Can you prove that animals that implement these equations from an evolutionary standpoint have an advantage? That's the only way I know that you can ask whether the equations that we're describing have any basis in biology. And the people have actually done experiments. They have tried to measure fecundity in animals and understand how well they can translate their genetic information in the pool as a function of the effort that they spend in their lifetime and the amount of reward that they get and the time that they spend getting these things. And those experiments, roughly are consistent with the idea that, these capture rates, if they're high, you are going to have, the opportunity to have a greater influence in the genetic pool. And that's a good thing from an evolutionary standpoint.
There, Reza, you'll get an advantage if you have better control, but or better choices about your foraging and your fecundity. But do you need to be optimal, or is that like the equilibrium point of a whole bunch of things that are each benefiting?
Basically, the experiments are very limited, but what they show is that if you have to work harder for the same reward, you are unlikely to have as big of an influence in the gene pool. Then have less babies.
Mm-hmm. And so that gives you selection pressure to have lower action costs.
Yeah.
For the same goal. Or you could maybe make do with being smaller, and so you need less food.
Mm. Yeah.
Now we get into this important question of, all this optimal control notion is under the premise that there is a fixed system in the world that you're trying to control. You have a fixed body, you have a fixed environment. The statistics of that are stationary. They're not changing over time. But when you have a complex dynamical system with lots of interacting agents, all that goes out the window.
Yes, we would never be here, right? If it wasn't for the asteroid that hit the Earth. Dinosaurs would still be our overlords, and we'd be these tiny creatures under the trees. So there's your non-stationarity.
Yeah, that's a rather significant non-stationarity. At least narrow sense stationarity. Is there a way, maybe this is getting back to your notion, Zhengwei, of hierarchical models, where you might say, all right, well, my immediate environment is in one state, but then the environment itself has some fluctuations, and those fluctuations are lawful. So then at what point do you make a model of the model?
I think that depends on like how we want to, how those latent states affect those dynamic that we really care about. Like if, and also about like the time scale that that determines the dynamic. If that really the dynamic really happens at a fast time scale, then we really want to like check those dynamic of the hierarchical latent states to figure out how it affects the lower level of the dynamics. Otherwise, if it is like a long time scale, then we probably it's like something it gonna converge to something like equilibrium, and then that will maybe not that beneficial to think about the hierarchical structure there.
One very natural place where we could think about hierarchical structure is Bayesian theory of mind. So that this posits that we make models of other people as acting agents, and we infer from what they do what their goals are, what their beliefs are, what they think about the world. That's a kind of very important hierarchical model that I think we all do all the time.
Yeah.
You know. Let's see. Colin asks, on the use of LQG, it's been found to have poor, robust performance margins. And so this is a case where one notion of optimal control is very brittle, that if you try to push it outside, maybe by a meteor, it's going to totally break. Whereas you might have some other system which is optimal, is suboptimal within your little narrow confines, but might be more robust to some of those other ideas. Have you seen any indications that humans might be suboptimal, or animals might be suboptimal in the narrow sense, but trade that off for being more robust?
I can take a crack at this. I know these, basically the environment may possess long-term opportunities that are quite different than the short-term gains that are presented to you. And I really like the experiments that were, well, these were not experiments, these were ecologists that were watching crows on the Pacific Northwest and how they dug clams from underneath sand on the beaches. And it's really remarkable how they spend effort, digging up the clam, and then they abandon it if it's too small from some sense in their head that I could do better elsewhere, even though the effort has already been spent to dig it up. And it's really a lovely paper where they look at the effort cost, the energetic cost of what it takes to dig it up, and then the probabilistic distribution of these clams on the beach, and then they make this decision-making basically algorithm, again, this capture rate that says, is it worth my time to go try to open up this clam by flying over some rocks, dropping it a few times, making sure it opens up, or just that I should spend that time and find a better clam? And that's the decision-making process that's taking place in the head of those little animals. And according to the equations, it says they often abandon the right size clam and wait for a better opportunity.
I definitely do that with pistachios.
You can see a good example of it, of how humans are behaving with toilet paper these days.
Go on.
When something becomes scarce, all of a sudden, the decision-making process, is very different than it was before.
Right. So this seems to be a risk-sensitive control, right? Where you're weighing some outlier event as being really bad.
Good point.
And so, yeah, go ahead.
Go on. No, I was just going to bring in, robustness. Robustness we usually think of as how do we deal with uncertainty, right? So this uncertainty in this case would be, we don't know exactly what's going to happen tomorrow to the supply chains in the US, and that's why you hoard up on toilet paper, I guess. I think this is the problem that you were talking about, Reza. Correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah, so really, how do we kind of model that uncertainty, and how do we deal with it once we have it? So yeah, one can try to account for the worst case, or one can try to really hit the middle. So in the average case, what is we still want to have a stable system. We still want to have toilet paper. Or the worst case is all supply chains are down. There's going to be no more toilet paper for another year. So we really, we try to hit for that worst case scenario, and that's a different way of dealing with it. So I think once we figured out what that uncertainty is, how do we actually plan for how we deal with it? That's the robustness issue, and I think that's how actually people differ from one to the other. Some people hoard, some don't.
A
great question, though.
Yeah, there's a follow-up on this, and one of the other questions on there that ask about how does risk preference modulate saccades and other movements. And I was just going to add that you guys should do these experiments. You should provide risky rewards and then see not just the choices that people make, but the movements that they make. And these are things that we can answer, I think, with the not too difficult experiments.
There's an interesting degeneracy between when you have uncertainty about something and you have utility about those things. So if you have something which is high utility, it could be also like high probability of a lower utility, because expected utility is the product of how likely something is times how valuable it is. And so then you end up with this question, like, when would you get one? How can you disentangle them? How can you tell whether something is high, like very useful, or just very probable? Larry Maloney has a really cool experiment where he has people taking bean bags and throw them at a touch screen, which I imagine could become a rather expensive experiment if you have the wrong subject participants. But what he's able to do is change the distribution of where things are rewarded, but maintain the same distribution of uncertainty of how accurate you can be. And so by changing the reward function, but not the posterior, you can separate them. And then conversely, you can like change the dynamics of the beanbag or things like this to make it more difficult, more uncertain where you're going to throw it, but keep the reward the same. And so you can start to disentangle those two.
Yeah, it's a beautiful point, Xaq. In that experiment, noise is added to your action. So therefore the outcomes become variable, but the value of those actions in terms of the reward at stake is an independent variable.
Speaking of robust control, I just want to mention a famous paper by John Doyle, who described guaranteed margins on an LQG regulator. So I highly encourage you all to go and read that abstract. It is very illuminating. You know the one I'm talking about, right? It's a good one. So we're coming towards the end of our time here. Let's look through. So here's a nice question from Yelsef. If it depends on your prior, optimal control is a complement of HMM. And so I think that this is a very deep question. Maybe Zhengwei, you can talk about that one. The relationship between the control and the hidden Markov model, because this is one of the things that I think you tried to incorporate throughout your tutorials.
Yeah, that's true. So I think like an optimal control for with some latent state is like a combination of inferring the latent states as well as interacting with those states by choosing some actions that try with the goal of maximizing some reward functions. So there are actually, I think, two aspects of them. One is like how those latent states evolve according to some dynamic, and maybe like since those states are latent and also the dynamic are latent, like you need to have a good inference base of those latent states or those parameters based on your measurements. And in addition to that, then you have the optimal control based on that to maximize your rewards. So, so that's like there are two systems. One is what is latent in the world, and then another thing is that based on your measurement, based on the measurement and like your actions, what would be your estimation of those latent states. So that's those two combined together will make like we'll combine the real world dynamic and your internal model and the states that interact with each other. So that's my understanding of how they relate and how they interact with each other.
This gets at the notion of what is a state, right? You see things in the world, you get your measurements, and you synthesize all those measurements into the state of your brain upon which your actions are based. And finding a good representation of the world that you can act upon is a critical component of doing a good job here. So this is both representation learning, like what should you represent, and policy learning, what should you do? You know, one of the things that we do as curious creatures in the world is go and touch things and move them and see where are the degrees of freedom in the environment. And so then we can represent them and figure out that we could potentially do something with them.
Mm-hmm.
So let's see, any final thoughts on optimal control and this whole experience of discussing it and teaching about it? Reza, Shreya, Zhengwei?
I think there's a question that I got to, and I wonder if I just think about it a little bit. Ladan asks, is there something between optimal control, is there a relationship between optimal control and motor learning? Can we say that motor systems become more optimal during learning? I was thinking about this example that I gave this morning about the high jump and how Dick Fosbury discovered the best way to clear the high bar using a jump procedure where you have your back to the bar rather than your belly. And but how did he do that? What were the processes by which he came up with that? What were the variables that had biological consequences for him? And there's Ladan, I would suggest reading the interview with him that appeared in Sports Illustrated some 30 years ago, where he describes how as a kid he was jumping, and then at some point he figured out a better way, and then the world followed, and that became the way to do that jump.
Well, excellent. I think that's a good place to close out for the day. I'm sure everybody is enthusiastic and thrilled, but also, brain filled up from all the tutorial work today. And some of you will be moving on to your project time. I hope you have a great time with projects today. And, maybe this discussion will help influence the way that you think about parts of the brain and how they can do things of value in the world. So I want to thank Reza and Shreya and Zhengwei for joining me here on this panel. And also
Thank
Maurice
you,
for contributing some
beautiful
intro. And also, as all the panelists mentioned this morning, fantastic questions by the audience. And it's just so great to see all these NeuroMatch participants so engaged in thinking about this stuff. This is really important and fun, and it's just it's glorious to see.
And thanks, Zach, for leading the discussion and really moderating this session and all the material that you contributed. Thank you.
Well, you make it very easy. It's really fun to do. Okay, goodbye, everyone.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks again.
Bye.